an interview last night, President Trump's lawyer said special counsel Robert Mueller will personally have a lot to answer for just hours after they rejected Mueller's reported latest offer to get a sit-down interview with the president. Trump's legal team said they have made a counteroffer, listing their conditions for access to the president, who is a subject in the wide-ranging investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Trump's attorneys also publicly voiced their desire for the probe to end within the next 3 weeks and suggested Mueller would be violating DOJ policies if it does not end.
We don't have an internal deadline. We are moving. I use the phrase expeditiously. Mayor, I know you've said, and I've said this. We want to see this come to closure soon here. Mayor?
Yeah, we do. It's about time that it ends. I also think, and I hope the special counsel is as sensitive to it as we are, we do not want to run into the November elections. So you back up from that. This should be over with by September 1st.
If it isn't over by September, then we have a very, very serious violation of the Justice Department rules that you shouldn't be conducting one of these investigations in the 60-day period.
But what Giuliani claims would be a serious violation is, in fact, a distortion, as the Justice Department Inspector General recently wrote that the 60-day rule is not written or described in any department policy or regulation, adding it is generalized, unwritten guidance that prosecutors did not indict political candidates or use overt investigative methods in the weeks before an election, not that they terminate investigations.
Well, and Mika, it's important to remember that Rudy Giuliani back in the 1990s was, he was whole hog into the investigation of Bill Clinton. And it was perfectly fine that Ken Starr conducted an investigation that went on years and years through one election after another after another. Robert Mueller's not going to be indicting anybody right before an election, and that'll be consistent with guidelines. But you have, if you're in pursuit of a couple of dozen Russians who you have evidence have violated American democracy and tried to undermine American democracy, you don't end that investigation because Rudy Giuliani tells you to end that investigation. In fact, if you need guidance from Rudy Giuliani, just go back and on just about every topic, see what he said back when Republicans were indicting or trying to indict Bill Clinton.
It's so obviously disingenuous. Giuliani went on to challenge the special counsel's motive for seeking an interview and suggested that Mueller will soon be the one under scrutiny.
We offered him an opportunity to do a form of questioning. He can say yes or no. We can do it. If he doesn't want to do it, he knows the answers to every question that he wants to ask. He's going to ask him, did you tell Comey to go easy on Flynn? The president's going to say, no, I didn't. Hey, Bob, you know it. Why do you want to get him under oath? You think we're fools? You want to get him under oath because you want to trap him into perjury. Well, we're not going to let you do that. The reality is, he doesn't need to ask a single question on obstruction. He has all the answers. They're not going to change. The president's not going to change his testimony. So stop the nonsense. You are trying to trap him into perjury because you don't have a case. I've never been involved in an investigation on either side that's more illegitimate than this one, that is so obviously more illegitimate. And I wonder, where's the sense of justice on the part of Mueller, on the part of the Justice Department? The real story here is not that this case isn't going to fizzle. It's going to blow up on them. The real question is what we talked about before. There's a lot more to what they did that nobody knows about yet. And Mueller is going to have a lot to answer for.
You know, Willie, with Rudy Giuliani going around and his eyes bulging while he's talking and looking disoriented, you look for excuses for America's mayor for being this wildly off base. Again, we just showed off the top of the show all of the members of the Trump administration and the Trump campaign that have already been indicted and are also that have already pled guilty. I mean, you, on top of that, have 25 Russians. This is an active investigation. Now, Rudy Giuliani says they have nothing. They already have Trump's second campaign
Look
manager.
at this list.
Indicted. Trump's deputy campaign manager, indicted. Trump's national security advisor, indicted. This is like the grand jury's indicted all of these people. Trump's foreign policy advisor that he said was one of his two most important, indicted. Trump's first campaign manager had charges dropped. And Trump's first congressional endorser now indicted. The man who put his name into nomination for Republican nominee, now indicted, and 25 Russians where the United States military and the United States intel agencies have said this is the forensic evidence of Vladimir Putin, the GRU, ex-KGB agents trying to undermine American democracy.
Yeah,
Willie.
I
mean, how does Giuliani even? I mean, how does he have the nerve to even go on there and say what he just said?
That's an awful lot of indictments and plea bargains for an illegitimate investigation. And Nick Conversori, that Trump's legal team continues to put out these arbitrary calls for the investigation to end based on I don't know what other than they want it to end to clear the president. May 10th, the Vice President of the United States said, quote, I think it's time to wrap it up, talking about the Mueller investigation. Rudy Giuliani has said time and time again, put up or shut up. And he also has repeated, as he did last night, that Bob Mueller doesn't have anything. Well, Joe just laid out everything that Bob Mueller has shown he has. And by the way, neither Rudy Giuliani nor you or I or anyone at this table knows what Bob Mueller has that we don't know he has.
Well, two things to note. First of all, the president's team, who has been delaying for 8 months an interview, is also now saying that it has to hurry up and end.
Right.
If they want it to end quickly, they should probably agree to an interview. But second, just look at what I'm just always amazed at what the mayor's team will say on the record. What he said in that interview is that the president's story, if told to Mueller, would put him into perjury.
Right.
So what he's saying is the president's story is wrong. It's a lie. He just admitted it on national TV because if the president's version of why he fired Comey is true, it is not a perjury trap, which just astonishes me. We have kind of blown right past the fact of what he admitted just there.
Yeah, and Matt Miller,
Right.
Go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just going to say to Nick, hey, Nick, you know, the point, and people think I'm joking about it. I'm not. If I were president of the United States and all of my lawyers thought I was too stupid or too much of a liar to sit down and just talk to Robert Mueller, I'd fire him. But this is all we have heard consistently from Donald Trump's lawyers, that he's too stupid to sit down with Robert Mueller, that Mueller will twist his head in circles, or that he's such a liar that he can't, that it would be a, quote, perjury trap. Now, listen, if I were going to sit down and ask you a series of questions, there would be a problem if the editors of the New York Times called me up and said, you know what, we can't let Nick go on today. Why not? Well, you know, you'll catch him in lies. My response would be, well, then don't lie. Just have him tell the truth. But this is what every time Giuliani and his lawyers come on and say he's too stupid or he's just not smart enough, they say that behind the scenes to keep up with Robert Mueller. But every time they come on to a show like Hannity's and say, you know what, we can't let him on there because he'll perjure himself. It's a trap.
Well,
You're exactly right. They're just saying he's such a liar that he can't help himself.
Well, sit down with the special counsel is no joke, and even an innocent person would go into that with some fear and trepidation. But the fact is, this is the president. He's got a team of qualified lawyers supposedly around him who can prep him for this. And if he can learn to tell the truth for 2 hours, he can get through it without being in perjury.
Learn to tell the truth.
Honestly, we
well,
need
that's
to
the
show more
problem.
respect to the American people. I mean, I hear Giuliani, I was like, what does he think? We're fools? You know, like, this isn't a clear obstruction of justice. You have a lot of corruption in here. You have our foes interfering in our democracy. And he accuses Miller of thinking that the president's team are fools. I think that he should be accused of thinking the American people are fools. You know, we need to, like, call it out. You know, this is ridiculous. This is really ridiculous. If they want justice, let's do the justice. You can demonstrate justice in front of us.
And what Giuliani's doing is it's not much of a legal strategy. I mean, he threw out this is a public relations strategy, and he sets these arbitrary deadlines, and he keeps moving the goalposts, trying to drum up sort of outrage among Republicans or perhaps some independents about this probe. And we have seen it's been somewhat effective. Like the polling on Mueller's the probe has dropped in recent weeks and months. That we know that he's been chipping away at people who view that this is the investigation has integrity and should continue. And they, meanwhile, as just pointed out, they're the ones who are dragging this on. And I think that is part of this argument here is they're trying to run out the clock and say this is too long, it's taking too long, it's a waste of taxpayer money, it's a waste of time, it's a distraction, it's slowing down the president's agenda. We've heard that becoming a more and more of a talking point among Republicans on the Hill. And as the DOJ regulation, Mueller may push pause here. He doesn't have to wrap it up before September 1st. This could certainly be something that resumes in November or December. And of course, we saw from James Comey, he doesn't actually have to push pause either. There's no hard and fast statute on the books that says he can't do this in election season.
So, Matt Miller, all those times I laid out previously that the Trump administration and Trump's lawyers have called for an end to it, Bob Mueller obviously has ignored those calls. Is he aware? Is he conscious? Do you think he feels any pressure at all from the outside on his investigation?
I doubt he feels a lot of pressure from the outside. I mean, look, when Bob Mueller was running the FBI, he was pretty impervious to public pressure. He always kind of handled his job at the FBI the same way he handles this one, which is to put his head down and kind of plow forward. I actually think, though, one of the interesting things about the president's strategy, I think the time when Mueller's probe was most politically vulnerable, not legally vulnerable, it's always been on very solid footing legally, was in this long kind of 5-month period between when they indicted Russians for the social media interference and when they indicted Russians for the hacking. Well, there was about a 5-month period where they were really dark, and you could see the president, I think that's when he was making some headway, arguing that this was going on too long. He's now back in business. He's back out, kind of indicting Russians, and to the point I think Jonathan made, if the president had just either agreed to the interview a long time ago or drawn the line a long time ago and said, "I'm not going to agree to this interview," they might have had a little bit better case, not a substantive case, but a better political case that this was going on too long. But by dragging it out themselves, I mean, they are the ones who are responsible, at least for the obstruction of justice portion of this, not being wrapped up. It could have been done a long time ago if the president had just agreed to an interview.
Well, Sam Stein, they're doing their best to drag their feet, their own sort of political obstruction of justice, obstructing where this goes, but they're even horrible at this. I mean, you look at the fact that now the administration is saying that they are going to sanction Russia and foreign governments for interfering with elections. Well, they're doing that specifically because of the indictments that were laid down last month, where Robert Mueller, using the U.S. military's information and the intel community's information, had the specifics of how the Russians tried to destroy our election, what computer screens, what their keystrokes were, what buildings they were in. The detail was so specific that we busted them red-handed beyond any reasonable doubt. But think about this. If Mike Pence had his way, and this had been shut down in May, like Mike Pence was saying, we would never have this evidence that basically showed what the Russians tried to do and what they're going to try to do again in 2018.
Oh, yeah, and that's just one part of it. I mean, for instance, before the Mueller probe began, we were operating in a reality in which the Trump campaign and Trump transition and Trump White House was insisting that there were no contacts with the Russians at all. Now we know.
Mike Pence said, I mean, can you believe that Mike Pence actually had the nerve to say in 2017, we were never talking to any Russians. Nobody related to this campaign
and it wasn't just
ever
Pence.
Talked to any Russians.
Yeah, we
were talking to Americans.
Yeah.
Just an extraordinary lie when you look at the collection of Russians that they were talking to throughout 2016.
No, I feel like sometimes people don't quite, because it's not presented comprehensively in front of them, people don't quite grasp how much Robert Mueller and his team, and tangentially people around it, have unearthed. And sometimes we're a little bit jaded about it. For instance, if we had just found out today that there was a meeting in Trump Tower with Russian officials, we would think it was an existential political crisis. But now it's sort of baked into the cake. The issue, though, and I think we have to bring this in here because it is a prong of this, is it's not just the media pressure for Mueller to wrap up his probe. It's not just Rudy Giuliani going out there telling Mueller to wrap up his probe. There is intense Capitol Hill pressure, too. And Rachel Maddow last night unearthed a private recording of Congressman Devin Nunes basically saying that they were going to take another stab at the impeachment of Rod Rosenstein after the Supreme Court confirmation battle hit. So we have this third prong, this congressional Republican prong, that seems to be working to essentially provide some cover for the Trump White House. And I guess to Casey, because she's so plugged in on the Hill, I mean, is this like a serious threat from Devin Nunes, or is this Devin Nunes acting rogue here?
Well, we're going to have to ask Paul Ryan whether he would let something like that go forward. I guess in theory they could make that resolution privilege and force his hand. But I think that the broader point that you're making, Sam, is the right one, which is that we're really headed for a real reckoning. And it can be easy to lose sight of it in the day-to-day back and forth, the drips of news out of the special counsel's office, the evolving what seemed to me to be basically a set of excuses that Rudy Giuliani is giving to Republicans as to why they should question what's going on with Robert Mueller. But look, Republicans are going to have to decide at some point, depending on what Bob Mueller finds, are they going to stand with Devin Nunes and defend the president at all costs? Because that's what Nunes is saying on that tape. He's saying that no matter what Mueller finds, we need to stand behind President Trump. And there's going to be a cadre of Republicans on the Hill who are going to do that. And there's, I think, a wide middle that is going to have to really look inside themselves and decide, okay, how am I going to handle this? We saw that, in Watergate, what turned the tide for Richard Nixon after it was clear that there were crimes that were proven was that Republicans in his own party turned on him.
Though, Zainab, there were, if you look at Devin Nunes, you look at some members of the Freedom Caucus. They remind me of the people that we conservatives used to call useful idiots that would fly down to Nicaragua and tell Daniel Ortega in the middle of a hot element of the Cold War that the United States was doing terrible things and were apologizing for Ronald Reagan's anti-communist actions. And we conservatives, we Republicans, excoriated them, called them useful idiots for always apologizing for the Russians, always being part of the Blame America First crowd. Well, when you look at what leaders of the Freedom Caucus are doing, when you look at what Devin Nunes is doing, I think we need to stop saying that what they're doing is trying to protect Donald Trump, because what they're actually doing is they're protecting Vladimir Putin and covering up more crimes that the United States military and intel agencies are digging at right now, this very moment. They've unearthed some of his crimes. They're looking for more crimes. But you have Devin Nunes bragging about trying to stop the investigation against Putin and Russia's interference in American democracy. It's shameful.
It is absolutely shameful. Joe, it's amazing. There's a division within America in here, between the White House and the institutions of America in here. We're actually, basically, what I hear about Trump supporting, trying to evade the investigation, I hear him defending the mafia, the biggest mafia of the world in Vladimir Putin, basically. You have a mafia, you have someone who is actually influential in the world, and we need to address him. We need to deal with that head on rather than being divided among us. So I feel like President Trump has a choice in here. Either step up and truly lead the country, ethically speaking, or back off in here and stop defending thugs and corrupt leaders around the world.
No sign that's happening anytime soon, but that would be the hope. Still ahead on Morning Joe. Criminal charges aside, Congressman Chris Collins says he will be on the ballot this November. We'll break down the government's case against him and what it means for Republicans' message heading into the midterms. You're watching Morning Joe. We will be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.